your son is gone. I said, gone? He said, he got killed. And I fell to my knees.
There are shots being fired.
There is a dead male on the scene.
She knew, I have to flee. I have to get away.
In this first episode of a two-part special, we reveal a tragic tale of greed.
There was an uptick in robberies involving wigs and other hair products.
And bitter revenge.
It was the worst night and the worst phone call that I have ever received.
In a payback story where nothing is as it first seems.
Now the police cannot trust anything that she says.
It was hard to believe that someone that young was going to be involved in something like this.
At 3:25 p.m. on January 22, 2016, police in Memphis, Tennessee, received multiple 911 calls about shots fired at an apartment complex near a school in the eastern suburb of Cordova.
The crime rate was lower in that area than some others. And to hear those shots ring out, startled neighbors, startled children.
Children are being released out of school. To have those kids being released, getting off the bus, and this type of event is taking place, had to have been really scary.
Memphis police respond quickly.
They see this young man laying in the parking lot in his own blood with multiple gunshot wounds.
Officers secure the area, finding no sign of an active shooter.
They see that they're not in danger. They see that they can't save him. He's pronounced dead at the scene.
A wallet in the man's pocket contains a driver's license.
They are able to ID the body of the male deceased victim as Eddie Tate Jr.
There is no shortage of stunned onlookers in the parking lot.
This is in the middle of the day. It's in an apartment complex. So once these shots were fired, there was a lot of activity. We had multiple witnesses.
They report seeing a dark green Honda in the lot. After the gunshots, a black woman got out of the Honda and did something unexpected.
This woman exited the vehicle, came around to the driver's side, removed Eddie Tate's body.
A female drags the male victim out of the vehicle, gets in the vehicle and drives off. So on the surface, we're thinking, a carjacking.
Is Eddie's death a tragic case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or is there more to this chaotic scene than meets the eye?
We quickly realized that it was not what we thought it was in the beginning.
Edward James Tate Jr. was born on August 27, 1985, to parents Eddie Tate Sr. and Gloria Adams.
And he was born in Shelby County, Memphis, Tennessee, at St. Francis Hospital, 6 pounds and 11 ounces. Bouncing, handsome boy. To me, my pride and joy, my only child.
Growing up in the small town of Oakland, just east of Memphis, Eddie, known to his friends and family as EJ, was independent and curious.
EJ, he was different. He's very quiet. He's well-mannered. He read a lot of books, and he was intelligent. He stayed to himself. He was a loner.
In 2000, Eddie entered Fayette Ware High School in Somerville, where he emerged from his quiet shell and eventually became vice president of his freshman class.
He went there for 4 years, and when he after graduated, he went to ITT, technical school. He majored in engineering. And for some reason or another, he didn't want to actually continue doing engineering. He wanted to be more out there on his own.
Around 2005, Eddie went into business with his cousin Mario.
Mario wanted to do hair. He said hair was on the market. It was really gonna sell and make money. So he told EJ he wanted him to come into the business with him. So EJ said, oh, okay.
The culture in Memphis with hair or weaves, it's huge, especially within the Black community. Our hair is very important to us because just from the beginning of time, it was the one thing I believe we could kind of own. So coming to, America, being, enslaved, oftentimes we didn't have control of our bodies. The hair was the one thing we could kind of, it could give us our own personality and our own sense of self.
And so if you come to Memphis, Tennessee, you will see that everybody's hair is done to a T. And if it's not done, they're headed there. And this is not just for women. This is for men as well. They spend hours in the barbershop. They spend hours at salons. And so this is a cultural thing.
Eddie and Mario focused on importing and selling natural human hair of the highest quality. It was more expensive, but they wanted to offer the best.
It's hair that's untreated, unbleached, untampered with in any way. It's pure hair.
Just to go to a storefront to buy your hair, it's not always the best choice. So EJ offered that. EJ offered this luxury hair. And the best part about it, he would deliver it to you.
A lot of people, especially in certain communities, expect that you're going to be able to, if you're paying $200, $300, $400, $500, $1,000, that you might, be able to get this hand delivered to you as well.
In his personal life, Eddie was also building a future with his new wife.
EJ had gotten married, and during that time, they had moved to Mason, Tennessee, over in Covington. They was inseparable. They did everything together. Their love was unique. They was great together.
In 2009, the couple welcomed a daughter. Eddie was a devoted father, but he struggled to remain a committed husband.
He had the wandering eyes. EJ went to wandering a little bit. His attention went to branching out. Finally, they decided they would go their own separate ways.
Although Eddie moved back to his childhood home in Somerville, he and his ex worked together to co-parent their daughter.
There's no arguing, no feuding, no disagreement. They would all be courteous to each other.
And in his professional life, Eddie and his cousin Mario continued to expand their business, dubbed Virgin Hair for Us.
And they both would go out in different separate areas in Fayette County and do the hair. Well, as they continued to do hair, their name became very popular. Then they decided, well, we're going to branch out more than Fayette County. We're just doing great with hair. So then it came into Shelby County.
Business was booming, but Eddie was lonely.
Maybe 2 years later, he met Edwina. We called her Wee Wee.
Edwina Marquette Thomas worked at a local hospital and was a single mother to 2 daughters. She made a strong first impression.
I think EJ fell in love with her because of her smile. Edwina has the prettiest smile that you have ever seen. She was just a good person, all around.
He said, Ma, I met a girl. He said, she quiet. She has 2 children. I said, oh, okay. And he said, he said, she got a sweet family.
Soon after they started dating, Eddie brought Edwina and her daughters to meet his mother.
They all came to attend my birthday. And it was always a joyful event. They was close. You could tell.
A few months later, the couple decided to move in together.
She had a genuine love, she did. You could see it on her face, she loved EJ. And EJ was with her, and he seemed to be, he was happy.
On January 22nd, 2016, the couple's future is shattered by bullets. Eddie Tate Jr. lies dead in the parking lot of an apartment building in a Memphis suburb. Witnesses have described a car and a woman they think were part of the incident.
There was a green Honda Civic, a female passenger in the vehicle who later removed Eddie's body from the vehicle, jumped into the driver's seat, and fled the scene.
Then, investigators learned that there was another suspicious vehicle that might have been involved.
One of the witnesses that I spoke to had said that they saw two cars driving away real fast right after the shots. One of them was green, the other was a gray or silver car.
A witness was able to identify both the green Honda Civic that was there on the scene minutes before the shooting took place. Also exiting the scene, a witness was also able to identify a silver Mitsubishi.
They both, once the shooting was over, fled at a high rate of speed. We assumed that one of them would have been a suspect car, one of them would have been a victim car, but of course, at that time, we didn't know for certain.
Memphis detectives continue to work the scene of a shooting that left 30-year-old Eddie Tate Jr. dead. Multiple witnesses recall a green Honda and a silver Mitsubishi fleeing the scene in the moments after the shots rang out.
As it turns out, our witnesses hear the gunshots. There's anywhere from several seconds to a minute delay. Then they look out and see what they see. So we did not actually have an eyewitness to the shooting. We had multiple witnesses that saw right after what transpired.
Some saw a young black woman in the green car. Another saw the driver of the silver car, who was also a young black woman.
They look out and then they see her running toward a silver Mitsubishi. She falls, and then she gets in the vehicle by herself and drives off at a high rate of speed.
The same witness has another important piece of information: the tag number for the silver car.
They gave that to the officers. The officers put out a broadcast to be on the lookout for it.
The witness accounts are consistent when it comes to the woman in the green Honda and the woman in the silver Mitsubishi. But from there, the details vary, including a possible third woman.
Several of the witnesses saw someone in multicolored leggings go inside the victim's green Honda.
They may or may not be looking for a third person, the person who is rummaging through the vehicle.
Witnesses, they see different things at different times. I may see you in a green shirt. Someone else may see you in a dark colored shirt. So, and that's kind of the situation that we ran into. Several clothing descriptions, several activities that people were doing, and we had to, kind of weed through that.
While detectives continue taking statements, forensic techs scour the crime scene for evidence.
Homicide detectives look at the body. They see that Eddie Tate Jr. was shot 4 times.
They found several projectiles and casings from a 9mm. Without the gun, you couldn't tell for sure. It is very likely that they all came from the same 9mm handgun.
Eddie Tate's wallet was accounted for. There was still money present in Eddie Tate's wallet.
Then, detectives get word that the chaos isn't over. It's still unfolding just around the corner.
Someone had come and flagged down some officers and said, hey, that they had a female that pulled up in front of their apartment that was beating on their door. When they opened the door, she said, "I'm shot, and he's dead."
EMS, the ambulance, and other first responders rush to the scene because the victim in this instance is still alive.
She wasn't talking. She was on her way to unresponsive.
By the time detectives arrive, the woman is already being rushed to the hospital. But outside the apartment, investigators spot the dark green Honda with a broken window and 2 bullet holes.
We have, this female that shot, and then their car's parked outside, and I looked in it, and it's all covered in blood. I talked to the people in the apartment, and basically that's, their story was that they were at home, and then all of a sudden they hear a knock on the door, someone screaming for help. They open the door, and she says that she's been shot.
She was losing breath, like she was like running out of breath, so they had her sit down. And she said as she sat down, the lady had a yellow couch, if I'm not mistaken, and she said the couch just started turning red. And she said at that moment, that's when they realized, like, okay, we need to get her help.
Investigators theorized the woman was also a victim in the attack, sitting in the passenger seat of the Honda when gunfire erupted.
Her survival instincts kicked in, and she knew, I have to flee. I have to get away. She immediately went into action. She pulled Eddie out of the car. She got over in that driver's seat and she fled. She drove herself to safety, trying her best to save herself.
I can't imagine how she was feeling at the time, knowing like I'm fighting for my life.
Detectives learned the woman is undergoing emergency surgery at a local hospital. She has been identified as 33-year-old Edwina Wee Wee Thomas, the girlfriend of the other shooting victim, Eddie Tate.
They were doing everything they could to keep her alive.
Edwina Thomas, known to loved ones as Wee Wee, is undergoing surgery at a hospital in Memphis, Tennessee. The single mother sustained multiple life-threatening gunshot wounds during the attack that killed her boyfriend, Eddie Tate Jr.
We know that there is a dead male on the scene and a victim that has been shot, transported to the hospital. So then, of course, we sent an investigator to the hospital, but she was already in surgery.
While they await word from doctors, detectives need to have a difficult conversation with Eddie's loved ones.
I was asked to make the notification to Eddie Tate's family. Once I get there, I explain to them who I am, what I'm here for.
He said, Miss Tate, you might want to sit down. And he came in and I said, where is he in the med? That's when you get hurt so bad. I said, he in the med. And he said, no. And I said, why are you here? And he said, ma'am, I got to tell you, your son is gone. I said, gone? He said, he got killed. The policeman said he got killed. And I fell to my knees. And I just screamed. I couldn't even scream. And I said, Lord God, you took my baby. You took all I had in life. And I just started crying and screaming. And I said, who killed him? Who killed my child? And he said, whoever killed him, they got away.
And it's not just Eddie who was shot.
And he said, well, we got shot numerous places too, in her stomach and other places on her body. He said, but she's in a bad shape too.
The news is even more brutal given what Eddie shared with Gloria just 2 days before.
He had called me that Wednesday night. He said, you might be getting another little grandbaby. And I said, oh, well, I'm slow. I said, another grandbaby? I said, where? Mom, what you mean, where? I said, oh, wee. Like that, I said, oh, we be pregnant. He said, yeah, we be pregnant.
Eddie's mother goes on to tell investigators that her son and his cousin Mario ran a cash business selling expensive hair bundles. That meant meeting up with people they sometimes didn't know, all while carrying large amounts of cash.
Virgin hair starts at about $120, and that's really just for a straight, let's just say 10 to 12 inch. The more you go up in inches, the more costly it is. If you're looking for anything over 22 inches, it's very possible for you to spend in the thousands for those.
As a precaution, she says, Eddie never went on deliveries alone.
Wherever he was at to go deliver the hair, he always would have a rider. I would ride with him, or his girlfriend would ride with him, but he always had just one person that would ride with him to deliver all the hair.
Eddie's mother tells investigators that Eddie and Edwina were making deliveries on the day of the shooting.
He had called me at 2 o'clock that day. He said, "Oh, I'll just call to holler at you." I said, "Okay." I said, "What you finna do?" He said, "Well, I got this old chicken head. I'm finna go sell some hair to it."
He did not name the buyer, but said she was a repeat customer.
He said, "I sold some hair to her this morning at 8 o'clock. And he said, I'm gonna go take the hair, take hair back to her. She said it wasn't the right length and she didn't like it. And she called me back and said that she wanted her money back. And he said, we don't give money back. I let her know I'll give her a different grade of hair. I'll let her look at some more hair, but we don't refund the money.
Eddie had his wallet on him when he was found, but it did not contain the amount of money expected after a big sale. Also, investigators did not find any bundles of hair in Eddie's green Honda. As investigators wrap up with Gloria, they know there is still one person who might be able to tell them what happened: Edwina.
The police would say, "We rush her to the hospital." I said, "Well," he said, "Well, maybe she'll gain conscience where she can talk and tell who had actually did the shooting."
Investigators in Memphis are looking into the brutal midday shooting of Eddie Tate Jr. and Edwina Thomas. Witnesses had seen Edwina drive off in Eddie's green Honda, as well as another woman driving another car.
There was a silver Mitsubishi that was also unseen, and a witness was able to at least provide the details, including the license plate of that vehicle.
Some witnesses also reported a possible third woman wearing multicolored leggings, rummaging through Eddie's car after the shots rang out. When detectives check on Edwina, doctors advise that her injuries are critical. She has 2 gunshot wounds, one to her kidney and intestine, and the other to her left forearm. But there's more: the poignant and harrowing detail that Edwina is 8 weeks pregnant. It's unclear whether Edwina and her unborn child will survive. Edwina Marquette Thomas was born on June 13, 1982, in Fayette County, Tennessee. She grew up with 2 sisters, 4 brothers, and a host of cousins.
Our family is pretty huge. We would all just meet at my grandmother's house on Sunday.
The older people, they would cook, and the younger crowd, like, we're outside having water balloon fights, and it was a great feeling, like, just to have your family around.
Wee Wee was my first cousin, but we kind of grew up as sisters. Just a great person, an amazing person, amazing friend, my very first best friend.
As a big sister, she was like a second mom. She treated me like her kid.
She liked to pull the big sister card to let me know, hey, I'm the boss, mom's gone, you have to listen to me. So sometimes we bumped heads, but for the most part, it was fun. I hung out with her a lot. She kind of taught me a lot.
As a teenager, Edwina attended Fayette Ware High School in Somerville, where she commanded attention.
We loved clothes. Like, she loved to look nice, she loved to dress nice, and she loved boys. She was popular with the guys, so I guess that's a good thing.
In 1999, Edwina fell in love.
That was her man, that was her boyfriend, that was her first real solid love.
Edwina became pregnant, but soon after the birth of her daughter, the relationship ended.
Just like any other breakup, in the beginning it's not good. But as we got older, and you understand that parenting is the most important thing, they reconnected, and so they ended up on good terms, which is a good thing.
Edwina took the responsibilities of being a single mom head on.
She did go on to Concord Medical, so she got a degree from there, and she started working at the hospital.
Over the next few years, Edwina gave birth to another daughter and faced more heartbreak in her personal life.
She really didn't date much until she met Crystal's dad, which was her second daughter. So then after those two, she met a new boyfriend. They had moved in together, plans on marriage, but he got into a motorcycle accident and he passed away.
The loss was devastating. Edwina was unsure if she would love again.
She just, was still dealing with that grief before she opened back up to someone else.
Eventually, that someone was Eddie Tate Jr.
When she started to date him, we saw a totally different side of her. It's like a more open, more loving, she just was happier. She was a happier person when she met him. You could just tell, like, he really cared, and he was her protector.
But now, Eddie has died from 4 gunshot wounds, and Memphis doctors fight to save Edwina's life. However, her injuries are too severe.
Edwina was later pronounced at the hospital.
It means her baby passed away too. For the second time in a matter of hours, detectives must deliver devastating news to another family.
My mom called and I merged her in with me and my sister, and she was crying.
I just remember her saying, "She's gone, somebody killed her." And at that moment, I remember dropping the phone and I fell to the floor. I fell to the floor crying. I could hear my mom crying. I could hear my brother crying.
That night was one of the, I'm not gonna say one of the worst nights. It was the worst night and the worst phone call that I have ever received in 34 years of living.
For detectives working the case, news of Edwina's and her unborn child's deaths means that the stakes are even higher.
She was about 6 to 8 weeks pregnant, meaning that law enforcement, they're no longer dealing with a homicide or a double homicide. Now they're dealing with a triple homicide.
News of the daytime shooting deaths of Eddie Tate Jr., Edwina Thomas, and their unborn child tears through Memphis, leaving the community outraged and on edge.
This was a young couple and a child that had not been born yet, so it pulled on the heartstrings of many. And with that, the community, law enforcement, families, the families of the victims, they wanted justice.
Detectives have one lead. A silver Mitsubishi witnesses saw speeding from the scene. A bolo on the vehicle's tag number produces nothing. Then, an officer notices a critical mistake.
The tag number on the vehicle, either between the witness calling in or the dispatcher, the last number was either transposed or it was incorrect.
So initially, we were looking for the wrong car.
And one of the officers changed the number up on the last digit, and it came back to a silver Mitsubishi. Had an address about 3 miles away from the shooting scene.
And records eventually reveal a very surprising person of interest.
Detectives determined that the driver of that silver Mitsubishi is 18-year-old high school student Victoria C.
Investigators run Victoria's name through a database of criminal records.
Victoria, she has a clean record. She's never been in trouble with the law.
The first thing that I really recognized was that she was really young. You know, it was hard to believe that someone that young was going to be involved in something like this.
Could this young woman really be a cold-blooded killer?
Detectives locate Victoria's residence, and it is her mother who answers the door.
She's informed us that, yes, her daughter's driving a car. And what did the police need with her daughter? So at that point, we asked her to have her daughter come home.
She called Victoria Say on the phone and said that the police officers were there and wanted to talk with her. Victoria showed up probably 10 or 15 minutes later.
She was acting very normal. She wasn't asking us why we were there. She wasn't asking us what was going on. She wasn't arguing, she wasn't combative or anything. And so she got into the squad car and they brought her down to the office.
Police also take possession of the silver Mitsubishi.
We verified that the tag information given us by the witness is what was on the vehicle. So we just immediately towed it to the impound lot so that, once the initial investigation slowed down, we'd get a warrant for the vehicle. So we go into the interview room and introduce ourselves. Victoria's very calm.
She's asked, obviously, the question about the shooting. Are you responsible for this? She says no. She never denied being on the scene, but she said she was not responsible for shooting the victims.
The questioning lasts several hours.
The detectives, they dig in real hard with Victoria. They let her know. We have witnesses that place you at the scene. So Victoria bends a little bit.
Victoria explains that she was spending the day with her friend and high school classmate, Shelby Isaac.
Shelby and Victoria were very good friends and had been for a while. They did know each other during high school. Victoria would do Shelby's hair. Shelby would buy hair for herself and then have Victoria put it in for her.
Victoria said they had met up earlier in the day with Eddie, the victim, to purchase some hair weave.
The trio met in the parking lot of a local fast food restaurant to make the transaction.
She and Shelby Isaac had went over there to meet the hairman and bought $250 hair from him.
Victoria explains that Shelby didn't really inspect the hair until later.
We learned that Shelby had decided that she didn't like the quality of the hair that she had purchased from Eddie.
And there was some discussion after that Shelby wanted to get her money back. There was a phone call made to Eddie Tate, wanted to meet him in the Sycamore Lakes apartments where Shelby Isaac lives. and they proceeded to go to that location.
Victoria says she drove Shelby to the apartment complex where Shelby lived to meet up with Eddie for the second time.
As they get ready to park, Shelby sees Eddie's green car, and obviously it's the car that they had met earlier. So Shelby gets out of the car.
Their initial suspect is about to explain her version of what happened on that terrible day. After Eddie Tate Jr., his girlfriend Edwina Thomas, and their unborn baby were killed in a shooting, Memphis police questioned 18-year-old Victoria C. about the crime. Victoria says that she and her friend, 18-year-old Shelby Isaac, met up with Eddie to negotiate a refund for a hair bundle.
She was unhappy with her purchase, so she went to get her money back.
Victoria claims she drove Shelby to the apartment complex, and then Shelby got out, leaving her to park.
As Victoria's parking the car, Shelby's already out walking over to Eddie's car.
According to Victoria, she hears gunshots. She sees Shelby with the gun in her hand. She screams, "Oh my God," and then Victoria runs back to her vehicle. She falls right before she gets in, and then she drives off at a high rate of speed.
She leaves Shelby. She drives across the street to another apartment complex and starts calling Shelby. "Hey, are you okay? Where are you?" Shelby says, "I'm right up here at the front. Come and get me." So Victoria pulls up to the front of the complex, picks Shelby up, they drive off.
Victoria places the blame directly on her friend Shelby, even claiming Shelby confessed to her.
Victoria then says that Shelby told her that she shot Eddie and that he was dead, and that there was another lady in the car and she had blacked out. She said that while she was standing there, the lady came to and said, "I'm pregnant." And so Shelby said that she did not shoot her again. Victoria said that after they went to a friend's house,
Victoria tells them the friend's name is Darian Melvin. She says that, a few hours later, she dropped Shelby off with another friend, Gary Dotson.
Shelby and Victoria show up where Gary's staying. Victoria leaves in the silver Mitsubishi. Shelby stays there.
and then Victoria gets a call from her mom. And her mom wants to know, why is the police at her house?
Victoria swears she was not the one who pulled the trigger. But is she just trying to protect herself?
When Victoria named Shelby Isaac as the shooter, we didn't know if she was lying. We didn't know if she was trying to blame someone else.
At that time, we weren't 100% sure. Did we have the shooter or did we have the driver?
Police arrest Victoria C. while they work to figure out the truth of what happened.
Victoria, she was charged with accessory after the fact, which is a very, very low-grade felony.
Police cannot trust anything that Victoria says, and they have to corroborate everything that she just told them. So now they have to focus on where was Shelby at and who is Shelby Isaacs.
The answer to those and many other questions lies in the next installment of this two-part special.
For nearly 200 years, one question has lingered over a quiet English village like a shadow that never truly disappeared. It is a story that has been told around fireplaces, whispered across generations, printed in newspapers, transformed into plays, novels, and films, yet no amount of retelling has managed to strip away its unsettling power. Even now, long after the people involved have turned to dust, One image continues to haunt those who stumble upon this case for the first time. A young woman walks toward an old red barn, believing she is only a few hours away from beginning a new life. She is never seen alive again. Months pass. Letters arrive. Promises are repeated. Excuses become more elaborate. And somewhere beneath a dirt floor, hidden from the eyes of everyone who loved her, the truth waits in complete silence. This is the story of Maria Martin. A woman remembered not because of the life she hoped to build, but because of the brutal way that hope was stolen from her. The murder itself was horrifying enough to shock 19th-century England. Yet what elevated this case beyond an ordinary homicide was something that even today continues to divide historians, criminologists, skeptics, and believers alike. The body was not found because of a confession. It was not uncovered by brilliant detective work. It was not revealed by an eyewitness. According to the family's account, it was found because one woman refused to ignore the same disturbing dream that returned night after night. Whether those dreams were coincidence, intuition, subconscious deduction, or something that defies explanation remains one of the greatest mysteries attached to this crime. The historical record cannot prove what truly happened inside Anne Martin's mind. What it can prove is that her insistence led directly to a patch of earth beneath an old barn, and beneath that earth lay the remains of Maria. That discovery would ignite one of Britain's earliest media sensations. Crowds would travel miles simply to glimpse the infamous Red Barn. Artists would paint the murder. Actors would reenact it on stage. Ballads would be sung in taverns. Newspapers would compete to publish every detail, every rumor, every theory. The killer's name would become infamous. The victim's face would become unforgettable. Yet hidden beneath the legends and folklore lies a tragedy far more human than the myths that grew around it. Before there was a murder, there was trust. Before there was a grave beneath a barn floor, there were promises of marriage. Before there was an investigation, there was a young woman desperate to believe that happiness had finally found her. And before the entire nation learned her name, Maria Martin was simply a daughter trying to escape the judgment of a small village. To understand why this crime still resonates after nearly 2 centuries, we have to forget everything we think we know about famous murders. There were no fingerprint experts. No forensic laboratories. No DNA analysis. No surveillance cameras. No telephone records. Justice depended almost entirely on people, on memory, on observation, and sometimes on instinct. Every lie carried weight because proving it false was extraordinarily difficult. Every missing person risked disappearing forever if no one asked enough questions. In rural England during the 1820s, it was entirely possible for someone to vanish into another county and never be seen again. That reality created opportunities for deception. And few men understood deception better than William Corder. Long before he stood in a courtroom facing the death sentence, Corder had cultivated an image that shifted depending on who happened to be looking at him. To some, he appeared educated and charming. To others, ambitious and confident. But beneath those carefully chosen expressions existed a pattern that would later become impossible to ignore. Small dishonesties had a habit of becoming larger ones. Excuses replaced accountability. Convenient stories appeared whenever uncomfortable questions followed him. The truth bent easily in his hands, shaped into whatever version best served him at that particular moment. People like that rarely appear dangerous at first. Danger often arrives wearing confidence. It smiles. It reassures. It promises tomorrow will be better than today. By the time someone realizes those promises were empty, the damage has already been done. Maria never had the luxury of seeing the complete picture. Neither did her family. Neither did the villagers who watched their relationship unfold through fragments of gossip and speculation. Because in villages like Paulstead, everyone knew something about everyone else. A neighbor noticed who arrived late at night. A shopkeeper remembered who purchased unusual items. Children overheard conversations adults assumed they would forget. Farm workers exchanged rumors in the fields. Housewives traded observations while collecting water or buying bread. News traveled faster than horses because it moved from mouth to mouth. Reputation was a form of currency. Once damaged, it could take years to recover. Sometimes it never recovered at all. Maria understood that better than anyone. She lived under the constant gaze of a society that judged women with extraordinary harshness while often excusing the men who shared equal responsibility. Every personal mistake became public knowledge. Every whispered accusation threatened to define the rest of her life. In another era, perhaps she might have begun again somewhere new without fear of being forever identified by her past. But 19th-century rural England offered few second chances, especially to young women whose private lives had become community gossip. Marriage represented far more than romance. It represented security, respectability, protection. A future in which yesterday's scandals might finally stop following her. When William Corder spoke of marriage, he was not merely speaking about love. He was speaking about escape. About a doorway leading away from whispers, judgment, and uncertainty. Whether he genuinely intended to fulfill those promises at any point remains one of the enduring questions surrounding this case. Historians continue to debate his motives, examining letters, testimony, and behavior for clues that might explain when deception became murder. Did he begin with honest intentions before choosing violence? Or had every reassuring word been carefully crafted from the beginning? The historical evidence cannot answer that question with certainty. But it can tell us this. On the day Maria disappeared, she believed she was walking toward a wedding. William Corder knew she was walking toward something entirely different. Some crimes happen in moments of uncontrolled rage. Others unfold slowly, built upon decisions made hours, days, or even weeks before blood is ever spilled. The Red Barn murder occupies an unsettling place between those possibilities. The surviving evidence leaves room for uncertainty about exactly how Maria died. Her body had lain hidden for too long before it was recovered, leaving investigators unable to identify a single definitive cause of death. There were indications of gunshot wounds. There were signs suggesting stabbing. There was also evidence consistent with strangulation. Instead of one clear answer, investigators faced several possibilities, each pointing toward the same unavoidable conclusion. Maria Martin did not die by accident. Someone ensured she would never leave that barn alive. And then someone worked remarkably hard to convince the world she had simply left home to begin a happier life. For nearly a year, that deception succeeded. Parents clung to hope. Letters were accepted. Questions were postponed. Life continued. The seasons changed. Fields were harvested. Winter settled over Suffolk before giving way once more to spring. All the while, beneath ordinary footsteps, beneath drifting leaves and falling rain, the secret remained buried only a short distance from the place where people carried on with their daily routines, unaware that one of England's most notorious murder scenes lay hidden beneath their feet. Sometimes the most terrifying crimes are not the ones committed in darkness. They are the ones capable of hiding in plain sight. And this case would prove just how long the truth can remain buried before it forces its way back into the light. The village of Polstead did not look like the kind of place where history expected horror to take root. Nestled among rolling fields in the county of Suffolk, it was the sort of English countryside that painters would later romanticize with warm afternoon light, winding lanes, grazing livestock, and cottages wrapped in ivy. At first glance, nothing about it suggested violence. Nothing hinted that one ordinary farming community would one day become forever linked with one of Britain's most infamous murder cases. In the early 19th century, life in villages like Polstead moved with the rhythm of the land rather than the clock. Sunrise announced the beginning of labor. The changing seasons dictated fortunes more reliably than politics ever could. A successful harvest meant survival through winter. A failed crop threatened hunger, debt, and uncertainty. Most families lived modestly, and every member of the household contributed in some way. Children worked alongside adults from an early age, learning not through classrooms but through repetition, responsibility, and necessity. Privacy, as we understand it today, barely existed. A stranger arriving in the village would be noticed before reaching the center of town. A family argument could become common knowledge by evening. A broken engagement, an unpaid debt, or an unexpected pregnancy did not remain private matters for long. Information drifted through the village with remarkable speed, carried from neighbor to neighbor until it became almost impossible to separate fact from speculation. In such a world, reputation was everything. It determined whom people trusted, whom they hired, whom they welcomed into their homes, and perhaps most importantly, whom they believed. That simple reality would later influence nearly every stage of the investigation into Maria Martin's disappearance. But none of the villagers could have imagined that, before the story was over, their quiet home would attract reporters, curiosity seekers, lawyers, artists, and thousands of strangers eager to stand where tragedy had unfolded. Long before that happened, however, there was only an old barn standing at the edge of the countryside. The Red Barn. Its name came not from blood or legend, but from its appearance. One section of the building was covered with distinctive red weatherboarding, making it easy to recognize from a distance among the surrounding farmland. It served an ordinary agricultural purpose, storing equipment and supplies like countless other barns scattered across rural England. Nothing about the structure itself appeared remarkable. It did not inspire ghost stories. It was not associated with local folklore. It was simply another working building surrounded by fields, exposed to wind, rain, and changing seasons. History often chooses strangely ordinary places for extraordinary crimes. A city alley. A family kitchen. A country road. Or, in this case, a lonely barn standing quietly beneath an open sky. Years later, visitors would travel specifically to see it. Artists would sketch it. Publishers would print illustrations of it in newspapers across Britain. The building would become more recognizable than many churches or castles of the period. Yet on the day Maria walked toward it, it was simply a meeting place. At least, that was what she believed. It is difficult today to appreciate just how isolated certain locations could feel in rural England during the 1820s. Outside the center of a village, silence settled quickly. Narrow paths wound between hedgerows tall enough to block the view beyond them. A person could walk for considerable distances seeing no one except an occasional farm labourer or shepherd tending animals in distant fields. There were no passing automobiles. No electric lights glowing from nearby houses. No steady noise from highways. Only birds crossing the morning sky, the rustling of trees moved by the wind, and the distant sounds of agricultural life fading into the countryside. Isolation creates opportunity. For lovers seeking privacy. For fugitives avoiding attention. And sometimes, for killers ensuring there are no witnesses. The precise events inside the Red Barn have never been reconstructed with certainty. No eyewitness survived to describe the encounter. No confession ever explained every moment. Historians can piece together only fragments, leaving empty spaces that time has refused to fill. Those unanswered questions are part of what continues to fascinate people nearly 2 centuries later. How long did Maria wait before William arrived? Did she sense danger before the attack began? Was there an argument? Did she realize, even briefly, that the future she imagined had already disappeared? Or did everything happen so suddenly that fear arrived only in the final moments? The evidence cannot answer those questions. The silence inside that barn remains one of the last things the murderer successfully concealed. What we do know is that William Corder left the village alive. Maria Martin did not. And almost immediately afterward, a carefully constructed illusion began to take shape. Disappearance, by itself, was not always unusual in 19th century England. Young men frequently left villages in search of work. Servants entered households many miles from home. Couples sometimes eloped to escape family disapproval or financial hardship. Travel was slower than today, communication even slower, and months could pass before relatives received reliable news from distant towns. William understood that reality. If Maria could be transformed from a murder victim into a woman who had simply left to begin married life elsewhere, suspicion might never fall upon him. It was an audacious lie. But like many successful lies, it borrowed enough truth to sound believable. Maria had every reason to leave. She wanted marriage. She wanted stability. She wanted distance from relentless gossip. If she vanished, many people could imagine exactly why. That made the deception dangerously convincing. Letters began arriving. Each one seemed designed not merely to provide information but to calm concern before it could become alarm. Maria and William had married. They were happy. Circumstances prevented them from visiting. Maria was unable to write herself because of illness or an injured hand. The explanations shifted just enough to account for every delay while preserving the central illusion. Hope has a remarkable ability to overlook inconsistencies. Families often accept comforting explanations long before they embrace devastating possibilities. Maria's loved ones wanted to believe she was alive because the alternative was almost unbearable. That hope bought the killer something precious. Time. Time for memories to fade. Time for evidence to disappear. Time for distance to grow between himself and the place where the crime had occurred. Looking back with modern knowledge, it is tempting to ask why no one questioned the letters sooner. But hindsight removes uncertainty. Those living through events rarely possess that advantage. Every explanation offered by William fit within the ordinary expectations of the period. Travel was unpredictable. Illness was common. Correspondence was irregular. Months without seeing relatives did not automatically suggest murder. It is one of the cruelest aspects of this case. The very optimism that kept Maria alive in her family's hearts also delayed the discovery of what had happened to her. Meanwhile, William Corder was already moving forward with astonishing confidence. He left Suffolk behind. He settled in London, one of the largest and busiest cities in Europe, where anonymity could be purchased simply by disappearing into the endless movement of strangers. For a man hoping to escape his past, there could hardly have been a better destination. London in the late 1820s was expanding rapidly, filled with opportunity, ambition, poverty, wealth, and countless newcomers seeking fresh beginnings. A man arriving there could reinvent himself far more easily than in a village where every childhood mistake remained common knowledge. William appeared determined to do exactly that. As Maria's family waited for the next reassuring letter, he was building another life entirely. A new address. New acquaintances. Eventually, even a new marriage. If not for what happened in the spring of 1828, history might never have remembered either of their names. Maria would have become another missing woman whose fate remained forever unknown. William might have lived out the rest of his life beneath an identity built on lies. But history has a peculiar way of disturbing even the most carefully buried secrets. Sometimes through chance. Sometimes through persistence. And sometimes through something far stranger. Spring returned to Suffolk with the quiet confidence it always had. The frost loosened its grip on the fields, birds reclaimed the hedgerows with their restless songs, and the countryside slowly exchanged the dull colors of winter for fresh shades of green. To anyone passing through Polstead, it would have seemed as though life was continuing exactly as nature intended. Farmers prepared their land, families resumed familiar routines, and the old red barn stood exactly where it always had, weathered by rain and wind, giving away nothing of the secret hidden beneath its floor. Yet beneath that appearance of normality, unease had begun to settle over the Martin household. It was not the sharp panic that comes with sudden tragedy. It was something quieter. Something slower. The kind of feeling that grows almost unnoticed, one unanswered question at a time. Months had passed since Maria had supposedly left to begin her new life with William Corder. The letters continued to offer reassurance, but reassurance has a fragile quality when it is forced to carry the weight of too many doubts. Every explanation seemed reasonable on its own. Together, they began to feel strangely incomplete. Why had no one seen Maria? Why had she never managed to send even the shortest personal note? Why did every message seem to arrive through William rather than through the woman who had once been so determined to build a future of her own? Questions like these rarely explode into certainty overnight. They gather slowly, almost imperceptibly, until silence itself begins to sound suspicious. Among those who struggled most with that silence was Anne Martin, Maria's stepmother. Her role in this story has long become the most debated element of the entire case. Some believe she experienced something beyond ordinary explanation. Others argue that her mind simply connected details everyone else had overlooked. After all, human intuition often notices patterns long before conscious reasoning catches up. Historians cannot determine exactly what she experienced, and no surviving document can conclusively explain whether her recurring dreams were supernatural, psychological, or the product of mounting anxiety. What is known is far simpler. And became convinced that Maria was dead. More specifically, she became convinced that Maria's body had been hidden beneath the floor of the Red Barn. Night after night, according to the family's later accounts, the same disturbing images returned. They refused to fade with daylight. Instead of becoming less vivid, they seemed only to strengthen her conviction that something terrible had happened. Imagine trying to explain such certainty to someone else. Imagine telling your family that you believed a loved one had been murdered because of what you saw while asleep. Even today, such a claim would likely be met with skepticism. In the 1820s, it risked sounding even more extraordinary. And did not let the matter rest. Whether driven by intuition, fear, grief, or some combination of all three, she continued urging that the Red Barn be searched. It is tempting, from a modern perspective, to focus entirely on the mystery of the dreams. They have become the element most often repeated in books, documentaries, and popular retellings. But doing so can overshadow something equally important. Families who sense that something is wrong often notice subtle inconsistencies long before investigators do. They recognize changes in behavior, missing habits, broken routines, or unusual explanations that outsiders dismiss as insignificant. Perhaps the dreams gave form to concerns that had already been growing quietly within Anne's mind. Perhaps they transformed uncertainty into action. Whatever the reason, she persisted. Eventually, her determination persuaded Maria's father, Thomas Martin, to investigate the place that had become fixed in her thoughts. On the 19th of April, 1828, nearly a year after Maria had disappeared, Thomas made his way toward the Red Barn. It was an ordinary day in appearance. There was no gathering crowd. No police cordon. No newspaper reporters waiting nearby. Only a father approaching a weathered farm building, carrying with him the faint hope that the terrible suspicions haunting his family might still prove unfounded. Hope can survive astonishing odds. Even after months of unanswered questions, many parents continue believing they will find an explanation that restores the world to something recognizable. Perhaps Maria had hidden belongings there. Perhaps the dreams were only dreams. Perhaps they would return home embarrassed by their own fears. The earth beneath the barn had other answers waiting. Thomas began to dig. At first there was only soil. Then resistance. Not the solid resistance of stone, but something different. Something that did not belong beneath the floor of an ordinary agricultural building. As more earth was removed, a sack emerged from the ground. Inside lay human remains. Time had done its cruel work. Nearly a year beneath damp soil had left the body in an advanced state of decomposition. Identification relied not on a recognizable face but on clothing and personal items that confirmed the devastating truth the family had desperately hoped would never be found. Maria Martin had never left to begin a new life. She had never reached a wedding. She had never started the future she believed was waiting for her beyond the village. She had been lying beneath the Red Barn all along. In that single moment, every reassuring letter collapsed into evidence of deception. Every comforting explanation became another layer of a carefully maintained lie. Every passing month transformed from proof of distance into proof of concealment. The search for a missing woman instantly became a murder investigation. Word spread through Paulstead with astonishing speed. Villagers who had spent months accepting William Corder's story suddenly found themselves confronting an unimaginable reality. Conversations that had once revolved around marriage now centered on murder. Familiar faces gathered in uneasy clusters, exchanging fragments of information, each person attempting to understand how such a crime could have remained hidden so close to home. The Red Barn was no longer simply a farm building. It had become a crime scene. And somewhere many miles away, William Corder was living under the assumption that the secret beneath its floor would remain buried forever. He could not yet know that the earth had finally surrendered what he had trusted it to hide. Nor could he know that the discovery of Maria's body had set into motion a chain of events that would pursue him all the way to London, strip away the identity he had carefully rebuilt, and ultimately place him before a courtroom where every lie he had told would be weighed against the silent testimony of the woman he believed would never be found. The story was no longer about a disappearance. It had become a reckoning. And for the first time since Maria walked toward the Red Barn believing love was waiting on the other side of its doors, the truth had begun its slow journey back into the light. Nearly 2 centuries have passed since the Red Barn murder first captured the imagination of Britain, yet to understand how an ordinary village became the setting for one of the country's most infamous crimes, we have to begin long before anyone spoke of murder. Long before newspaper headlines, crowded courtrooms, and endless speculation, there was only a small farming community where life appeared so predictable that tomorrow often resembled yesterday. It was a place where people measured time by the harvest, where families remained rooted to the same land for generations, and where every familiar face carried a story that everyone else believed they already knew. Polstead, in the county of Suffolk, was not wealthy, nor was it remarkable by the standards of early 19th century England. It was surrounded by gently rolling farmland divided by hedgerows that had stood for decades, perhaps centuries. Narrow dirt lanes connected scattered cottages whose chimneys released thin streams of smoke into the cool morning air. Fields stretched toward the horizon, changing color with the seasons, from the rich greens of spring to the golden tones of late summer before surrendering once again to the gray stillness of winter. The landscape possessed a quiet beauty that rarely demanded attention. It was the kind of place travelers might pass without remembering, convinced they had seen countless villages just like it. For the people who lived there, however, Polstead was an entire world. Most families rose before dawn. The first light creeping over the countryside marked the beginning of another day shaped by physical labor. Men walked toward fields carrying tools worn smooth by years of use. Women prepared meals, managed households, cared for children, and often worked alongside the rest of the family whenever extra hands were needed. Even the youngest children learned quickly that survival depended upon contribution rather than comfort. There was little room for idleness, because every season carried responsibilities that could not be postponed. The rhythm of village life was remarkably consistent. The ringing of the church bell punctuated the week. Market days brought brief excitement as neighboring communities gathered to trade livestock, produce, fabric, and tools. Sunday services offered not only worship but one of the few opportunities for nearly everyone in the village to assemble in a single place. Births, marriages, illnesses, and funerals became shared experiences rather than private family matters. News traveled without effort because it moved through conversations instead of newspapers. Every encounter at the blacksmith's workshop, every visit to the mill, every stop outside the church became another opportunity for stories to spread. In modern cities, anonymity is almost effortless. In villages like Polstead, anonymity barely existed. Every newcomer attracted attention. Every unusual visitor inspired questions. Every argument overheard through an open window risked becoming tomorrow's discussion. Privacy belonged more to imagination than reality. This constant visibility shaped the behavior of everyone who lived there. People understood that reputation could determine opportunities, friendships, marriage prospects, and social standing. A single mistake might follow someone for years, repeated so often that eventually the rumor became more influential than the truth itself. For young women especially, the burden of public judgment was severe. Society demanded standards that were rarely applied equally to men. Respectability was treated almost as a form of currency, earned slowly but capable of disappearing overnight. Once damaged, it could prove almost impossible to restore. Compassion often surrendered to gossip, and gossip possessed extraordinary endurance. The village itself did not intentionally create cruelty. It simply reflected the values of its era. Neighbors believed they were protecting morality by observing one another closely. Parents raised their children according to expectations that had existed for generations. The church reinforced ideals of duty, modesty, and obedience. Few questioned whether those expectations were fair because they seemed as permanent as the fields surrounding them. Against this backdrop stood farms that varied greatly in prosperity. Some families struggled constantly, balancing modest harvests against growing expenses. Others enjoyed relative comfort through larger holdings, healthier livestock, or inherited property. Wealth did not necessarily create luxury, but it offered stability. A successful farm could provide influence within the community, allowing its owners to command greater respect than families forced to survive through seasonal labor or modest trades. Economic differences quietly shaped relationships throughout the village. Marriage was rarely viewed as a purely romantic decision. Love certainly existed, but practical considerations often accompanied it. Families considered income, land, reputation, and future security alongside affection. A marriage could strengthen social standing or ease financial hardship. It could also determine whether children inherited opportunity or continued struggling through the same hardships their parents had endured. These realities formed the invisible framework surrounding nearly every personal decision. To modern eyes, such calculations may appear cold. To those living in 19th-century rural England, they were simply practical. Failure to think practically could have consequences lasting an entire lifetime. The landscape itself encouraged a peculiar mixture of closeness and isolation. The village centre gathered people together each week, yet only a short walk beyond its cottages the countryside became strikingly quiet. Thick hedgerows bordered narrow paths, limiting visibility and muffling distant sounds. Ancient oak trees cast long shadows across uneven ground. Small streams wound through fields where livestock grazed behind wooden fences weathered by countless seasons. On calm days, the loudest sounds often came from nature itself. The wind sweeping across open farmland. Birds calling from tree branches. The creaking of wagon wheels carrying hay. The rhythmic strike of tools against earth. Silence was not unusual. It was expected. That silence would later become one of the most unsettling aspects of the Red Barn murder. It reminds us that horrific acts do not always unfold amid chaos. Sometimes they occur in places so peaceful that nothing seems capable of disturbing them. The countryside surrounding Paulstead possessed another quality that modern audiences sometimes overlook. Distance felt different. A journey of only a few miles required considerable effort. Roads were uneven, travel depended upon horses or walking, and weather frequently dictated how quickly someone could move between neighboring villages. Communication suffered similar limitations. Letters took time. Unexpected visits required planning. Information spread steadily, but never instantly. This slower pace shaped the investigation that would later follow Maria's disappearance. Questions could remain unanswered for weeks. Explanations could survive longer because verification was difficult. A person determined to deceive others possessed advantages that would scarcely exist today. Yet these same limitations also fostered strong community memory. People remembered faces. They remembered conversations. They noticed routines. When someone failed to appear where they normally would, eventually someone asked why. It was this balance between familiarity and limited communication that gave Paulstead its distinctive character. Everyone watched one another. But no one could watch everything. As the years passed, the village experienced little reason to believe its peaceful routines would ever change. Children grew into adults, farms passed between generations, and life continued according to traditions that seemed almost immune to history's larger upheavals. Wars were fought elsewhere. Political debates unfolded in distant cities. Royal decisions affected taxation and trade, yet daily existence remained rooted in the same fields, the same cottages, and the same narrow roads. Nothing about Paulstead suggested it was destined for notoriety. No monument stood waiting for tourists. No landmark hinted at future tragedy. The Red Barn itself remained simply another agricultural building, valued for its usefulness rather than its appearance. Farmers stored supplies there, sheltered equipment from the weather, and carried on with work that had little reason to attract attention. Had events unfolded differently, the barn might have disappeared into history without leaving so much as a footnote. Instead, it would become one of the most recognizable crime scenes in British history. But before the barn became infamous, before William Corder's name appeared in newspapers across the country, and before Maria Martin's disappearance transformed into a national obsession, there existed only ordinary lives unfolding beneath ordinary skies. It is precisely that ordinariness which makes the story so unsettling. Evil rarely announces itself in advance. It does not wait for dramatic landscapes or extraordinary circumstances. Sometimes it enters quietly, through familiar doors, wearing a trusted face, speaking with reassuring confidence, until one ordinary village discovers that the greatest danger was never a stranger passing through, but someone who had been standing in plain sight all along. If an outsider had walked through Polstead in the years before Maria Martin disappeared, they might have concluded that it was a place almost untouched by uncertainty. The cottages stood close enough that neighbors could recognize one another by the sound of approaching footsteps. Gardens spilled over with herbs, vegetables, and flowers planted as much for necessity as for beauty. Chickens wandered freely across uneven yards, children chased one another along narrow lanes, and smoke drifted lazily from stone chimneys that had weathered decades of English winters. It was not a wealthy village, but it was a living one, sustained by routine and bound together by familiarity. Yet beneath that calm surface existed a society governed by unwritten rules that were often more powerful than any law. Respect had to be earned. Honor had to be protected. Appearances mattered. People were expected to know their place, and stepping outside the boundaries established by tradition carried consequences that could linger for years. Forgiveness was possible, but forgetting was much more difficult. Stories had a habit of becoming permanent. Once a reputation settled over someone's name, it often followed them everywhere they went within the village. For women, the burden was especially unforgiving. A man's mistakes could sometimes be dismissed as youthful recklessness or poor judgment. A woman who found herself at the center of scandal rarely received the same generosity. Society expected modesty, restraint, and obedience, and those expectations were reinforced not only by religious teachings but by the opinions of neighbors whose approval influenced nearly every aspect of daily life. There was no need for public condemnation. A glance exchanged across a marketplace. A conversation that suddenly stopped when someone approached. A door that was no longer opened as warmly as before. These quiet gestures carried their own message. They reminded people that acceptance within the community depended upon conformity. In many ways, the village functioned as its own court of opinion. No judge presided. No formal verdict was announced. Yet reputations rose and fell through countless small interactions repeated over months and years. This environment shaped every relationship within Polstead. Friendships, business partnerships, courtships, even family connections were influenced by how others perceived them. Marriage, therefore, was far more than an expression of affection. It represented legitimacy, stability, and social acceptance. A wedding did not simply unite two people. It united families, secured futures, and often repaired reputations that might otherwise remain permanently damaged. Against this backdrop, every promise of marriage carried tremendous significance. To modern audiences, it can be difficult to fully appreciate just how transformative such a promise could be. Today, individuals possess opportunities to relocate, pursue careers independently, or rebuild their lives in entirely new communities. Early 19th century England offered far fewer avenues for reinvention. Most people remained close to where they were born. Economic limitations restricted mobility, and social expectations narrowed personal choices even further. For someone hoping to leave behind painful memories or persistent judgment, marriage often appeared to be the most realistic path toward a different future. That reality helps explain why hope could become so powerful. Hope encouraged patience. Hope encouraged trust. Hope persuaded people to overlook inconsistencies they might otherwise question. It also made deception extraordinarily effective. William Corder understood people remarkably well. Historical accounts describe him as intelligent, personable, and capable of presenting different versions of himself depending on the company he kept. To acquaintances, he could appear confident and ambitious. In conversation, he possessed the ease of someone comfortable shaping impressions. Those qualities often opened doors that might have remained closed to others. Charm, however, should never be mistaken for character. The two are not the same. Charm influences first impressions. Character reveals itself over time. By the period leading up to his relationship with Maria Martin, William's past already contained troubling signs. He had been associated with dishonest financial dealings, including forgery and theft. These incidents suggested more than isolated lapses in judgment. They hinted at a willingness to manipulate situations whenever personal advantage outweighed honesty. Yet even that history did not automatically mark him as a future murderer. Communities often tolerate individuals whose behavior exists in shades of gray. People excuse questionable decisions. They believe someone deserves another chance. They separate smaller acts of dishonesty from the possibility of extreme violence. Very few people encounter someone and immediately imagine that person capable of taking another human life. The transformation from liar to killer rarely appears obvious in advance. It becomes visible only after tragedy forces everyone to look backward. As William moved through village life, he remained one familiar figure among many. He belonged to a family with greater financial comfort than some of their neighbors, and that status carried its own influence. Prosperity encouraged assumptions of respectability. A well-established family often benefited from goodwill that poorer households struggled to receive. Appearances mattered. Good clothing suggested reliability. Confident speech suggested education. Family property suggested stability. These impressions could mask deeper flaws remarkably well. Meanwhile, the countryside surrounding Paulstead continued its quiet cycle, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding within it. The fields demanded planting regardless of personal heartbreak. Livestock required feeding whether families celebrated births or mourned deaths. Rain arrived without concern for reputation. The seasons advanced according to their own unchanging rhythm. There is something haunting about that contrast. Nature rarely pauses for human suffering. The same sunrise that warmed hopeful lovers also illuminated grieving parents. The same rain that nourished growing crops eventually soaked the ground beneath which terrible secrets could be hidden. Perhaps nowhere embodied that contradiction more completely than the Red Barn itself. Standing beyond the busiest part of the village, it occupied a place that was familiar without attracting attention. Farmers came and went according to ordinary necessity. Wagons passed nearby. Supplies were stored within its wooden walls. Nothing about its appearance invited fear. The faded red weatherboarding simply distinguished it from surrounding farm buildings, giving local people an easy way to identify it. The name carried no sinister meaning. Not yet. It was simply the Red Barn. Children likely passed it without hesitation. Workers thought about their tasks rather than the building itself. Travelers saw another structure blending naturally into the agricultural landscape. History often changes the meaning of places after violence occurs. What once appeared ordinary becomes impossible to view without remembering what happened there. Today, photographs of the Red Barn immediately evoke thoughts of Maria Martin's murder. Before 1827, it inspired no such association. It existed quietly, waiting without anyone realizing that it would soon become inseparable from one of Britain's most enduring criminal legends. That transformation would not happen because of the building itself. Buildings do not create tragedy. People do. And as spring gave way to summer in 1827, the lives of Maria Martin and William Corder were moving steadily toward a meeting that each of them understood in profoundly different ways. For one of them, it represented hope. For the other, history would eventually suggest it may have represented something far darker. Neither the villagers tending their fields nor the families gathered around evening fires could have imagined that the ordinary routines surrounding them were approaching their final moments of innocence. Before long, every familiar lane, every whispered conversation, and every glance toward the lonely Red Barn would be colored by the knowledge that evil had walked those same paths unnoticed, hidden not behind a stranger's face. But behind the comforting smile of someone the village believed it already knew. There is a tendency, when looking back at historic crimes, to imagine that the warning signs must have been obvious. We search old records for moments that seem to foreshadow the ending, convinced that someone should have recognized the danger before it was too late. Reality is rarely so accommodating. Life is not experienced with the benefit of hindsight. It unfolds one ordinary day at a time, and what later appears to be an unmistakable clue often looked entirely insignificant in the moment. That was the world in which the people of Paulstead lived. No one woke each morning believing they were witnessing the opening chapter of a story that would survive for centuries. The men walking to their fields were thinking about weather, crops, and livestock. Mothers worried about food, illness, and keeping their households together. Children filled the village lanes with laughter that disappeared into the evening air as lamps were lit behind cottage windows. The concerns of daily life left little room for imagining extraordinary evil. The England of the 1820s was also a nation in transition. The Industrial Revolution had begun transforming cities, factories, and commerce, but many rural communities still moved at a much older pace. Suffolk remained deeply connected to agriculture, and villages like Paulstead preserved traditions that had changed very little over generations. The wider world seemed distant. London, with its crowded streets, expanding industries, and endless opportunities, belonged almost to another country in the minds of many villagers. Few would ever travel there. Fewer still would build new lives there. Most people expected to remain where they had been born. They would work the same land their parents had worked. They would marry someone from a neighboring village. They would grow old surrounded by familiar faces. Their lives were shaped not by constant change, but by continuity. That continuity created a powerful sense of belonging, but it also created invisible boundaries. Those who struggled to fit the expectations of the community often found themselves carrying burdens that became heavier with every passing year. A person's past was difficult to escape when everyone around them remembered it. It was in this environment that Maria Martin grew into adulthood. She was not simply another young woman in the village. By the time she met William Corder, her name had already become known within Paulstead for reasons that brought more judgment than sympathy. Like many women of her era, the choices available to her were limited, and the consequences of personal hardship were often magnified by public opinion. She had experienced relationships that ended in heartbreak and loss. She had endured the grief of losing a child, and she later gave birth to another outside of marriage. Those experiences were deeply personal, yet in a village where little remained private, they also became part of the identity others assigned to her. Modern audiences may find that judgment difficult to understand. Today, such circumstances would not necessarily define an individual's entire future. In 19th-century rural England, however, they could shape the way neighbors viewed a woman for years. Compassion was often overshadowed by moral expectation. Instead of seeing someone navigating difficult circumstances, many people saw only a departure from the standards society demanded. None of that diminished Maria's humanity. If anything, it makes her story even more poignant. She was not a symbol or a cautionary tale. She was a young woman searching for stability in a world that offered very little forgiveness. Those who knew her described someone with intelligence, determination, and a lively personality. She was capable of warmth and affection, yet she also understood the weight of the whispers that followed her. Every sideways glance, every conversation that fell silent as she approached, every reminder that reputation mattered more than explanation left its mark. It is easy to imagine how appealing the promise of a new beginning must have seemed. A marriage. A different town. A chance to leave behind the labels that others had attached to her. Not because she wished to erase her past, but because she hoped her future might finally be judged on its own merits. William Corder entered her life at precisely the moment when such hope carried extraordinary power. He came from circumstances that appeared more secure. His family enjoyed greater financial stability than many in the village, and he possessed an easy confidence that often accompanies those who have rarely doubted their ability to shape the opinions of others. Contemporary accounts suggest that he was articulate, socially comfortable, and capable of adapting his manner depending on the people around him. To someone longing for certainty, those qualities could be reassuring. Confidence often resembles reliability. A persuasive voice can sound remarkably similar to sincerity. Promises delivered with conviction become easier to believe. This is one of the quiet tragedies found in so many true crime stories. The qualities that draw victims toward offenders are frequently the same qualities that allow offenders to hide in plain sight. William did not appear as a monster. History rarely introduces monsters that way. He appeared as someone capable of offering exactly what Maria believed she needed most: a future. Yet beneath that polished exterior lay patterns that deserve attention. His earlier involvement in theft and forgery reflected more than youthful recklessness. Such acts required planning, deception, and a willingness to manipulate trust for personal benefit. While those offenses were far removed from murder, they suggested a personality increasingly comfortable crossing moral boundaries whenever doing so offered an advantage. Crossing one boundary often makes the next feel less significant. Small lies become larger lies. Broken promises become calculated deception. Over time, the distance between dishonesty and cruelty can shrink in ways that are almost invisible until irreversible harm has been done. Whether William already possessed murderous intentions when his relationship with Maria began is something history cannot answer. The surviving evidence does not allow us to see inside his thoughts, and responsible storytelling demands acknowledging those limits. We can examine his actions. We can study his choices. We can compare his words with what later occurred. But motive remains more elusive than fact. What we do know is that their relationship developed against a backdrop of mounting pressure. Marriage was discussed. The possibility of leaving Paulstead together became increasingly real. For Maria, those conversations represented hope finally taking shape. For William, they represented commitments that would soon require action. As spring approached in 1827, the countryside around Paulstead showed little sign that anything unusual was about to happen. Trees burst into fresh leaves, fields awakened beneath warmer sunlight, and the village settled into another season of familiar routines. People greeted one another in passing, attended church, worked the land, and planned for the months ahead with the quiet confidence that tomorrow would resemble today. No one could see the invisible path already forming. A path leading toward an isolated barn standing beyond the village. A path walked by a young woman carrying expectations instead of fear. A path that would end not with wedding vows, but with one of the most enduring mysteries in British criminal history. Because somewhere between promise and betrayal, between hope and violence, between trust and deception, the ordinary world of Paulstead was about to disappear forever. The peaceful village that had spent generations worrying about harvests, weather, and reputation would soon become known for something entirely different. Its name would be spoken not by neighboring farmers, but by journalists, lawyers, playwrights, historians, and generations of true crime enthusiasts seeking to understand how such profound darkness could emerge from a place that once seemed so utterly ordinary. If history has remembered this case for nearly 200 years, it is largely because of the man who committed the crime and the mystery surrounding its discovery. His name appears in headlines. His face has been reproduced in books, documentaries, and courtroom sketches. The Red Barn itself has become a symbol recognized far beyond the borders of Suffolk. Yet buried beneath all of that attention is a truth that deserves to remain at the center of this story. Before Maria Martin became a victim, she was a person. She was not simply the young woman found beneath the floor of an old barn. She was not merely the subject of a sensational murder. She was someone's daughter. Someone's sister. A woman who laughed, hoped, worried, made mistakes, recovered from heartbreak, and believed, perhaps more than anything else, that her life still had the potential to become something better. That is where her story deserves to begin. Maria Martin was born in 1801 into a family whose life revolved around hard work rather than comfort. Her father, Thomas Martin, earned a modest living as a mole catcher, a profession that may sound unusual today but played an important role in rural England. Moles could devastate farmland by tunneling beneath crops and pasture, making experienced mole catchers valuable to local farmers. It was physically demanding work that required patience, endurance, and an intimate understanding of the countryside. The Martin family was never wealthy. Like countless rural households of the early 19th century, they measured prosperity not by luxury but by whether there was enough food for the table, enough fuel for the fire, and enough work to carry them through another season. Every member of the household understood the value of labor. Survival depended upon contribution, and children learned early that they were part of something larger than themselves. Maria grew up surrounded by the familiar sights of village life. She would have known every winding lane that crossed Polstead, every cluster of cottages, every field that changed color with the passing seasons. She watched the same church bell call families together week after week. She witnessed harvests that brought relief and winters that tested endurance. The countryside was not simply the backdrop of her childhood, it was woven into every part of her daily existence. Those who later described Maria often painted the portrait of a young woman who stood out from many of her peers. Contemporary accounts suggest that she was considered attractive, with dark features that drew attention wherever she went. Yet it was not merely her appearance that people remembered. She was said to possess confidence, intelligence, and an energetic personality that made her difficult to ignore. In another life, under different circumstances, those qualities might have opened doors. Instead, they sometimes attracted scrutiny. Small villages have a curious relationship with individuality. Someone who blends into the crowd is rarely discussed. Someone who possesses unusual beauty, confidence, or independence often becomes the subject of constant observation. Every friendship is noticed. Every courtship is analyzed. Every decision becomes another topic of conversation. Maria lived beneath that gaze for much of her adult life. Her personal relationships became known within the community, not because she sought attention, but because privacy scarcely existed in a place like Polstead. Before meeting William Corder, Maria had experienced love, disappointment, and profound grief. One of her earlier relationships resulted in the birth of a son who died in infancy. Later, she entered another relationship and gave birth to another child outside marriage. To modern audiences, these experiences may evoke compassion. To many people living in rural England during the 1820s, they invited judgment. Society at the time placed an overwhelming burden upon women to preserve their reputations, while often extending greater forgiveness to the men involved in the same relationships. A woman's circumstances could quickly become her identity. Once gossip attached itself to a name, separating fact from rumor became almost impossible. Maria found herself carrying that burden every day. Imagine walking through a village where conversations pause as you approach. Imagine sensing that strangers already believe they know your story before you speak a single word. Imagine trying to build a future while constantly being reminded of your past. That was the reality confronting many women in Maria's position. Yet reducing her life to the scandals remembered by history would be deeply unfair. The surviving records reveal glimpses of resilience. Despite hardship, Maria continued looking forward rather than backward. She remained devoted to the possibility that life could still improve. She worked, cared for those around her, and continued searching for the stability that had so often escaped her. Hope became one of her defining characteristics. Not naive optimism. Not blind faith. But the quiet determination to believe that tomorrow did not have to resemble yesterday. That hope would eventually lead her toward William Corder. There is an understandable temptation to portray Maria as someone incapable of recognizing danger, but history offers little support for such a simplistic view. She had already experienced disappointment. She understood that promises could be broken. She knew firsthand how difficult life could become when relationships failed. Precisely because of those experiences, the promise of genuine commitment carried enormous emotional weight. Marriage represented more than romance. It represented legitimacy in the eyes of society. It represented security for herself and her child. It represented the possibility of closing one painful chapter and beginning another defined not by gossip but by acceptance. People who examine this case from the safety of hindsight sometimes ask why Maria trusted William. Perhaps a more revealing question is this. Why shouldn't she have? He spoke of marriage. He discussed a future together. He belonged to a family with greater financial stability. He projected confidence. Most importantly, he appeared willing to offer exactly what she had spent years hoping to find. Trust is rarely built in a single conversation. It develops gradually, strengthened by repeated reassurances until doubt becomes increasingly difficult to justify. Like countless victims throughout history, Maria was not deceived because she lacked intelligence. She was deceived because someone she cared about carefully cultivated reasons for her to believe him. That distinction matters. Victims are often judged by decisions viewed through the clarity of hindsight. The responsibility belongs not to the person who trusted, but to the person who deliberately exploited that trust. As Maria's relationship with William deepened, the possibility of leaving Paul Stead began to feel increasingly real. Every discussion of marriage offered another glimpse of the future she imagined waiting beyond the village boundaries. A different town meant fewer whispers. A husband meant greater social security. A fresh beginning meant the chance to define herself by the life she would build rather than the mistakes others insisted on remembering. Hope has an extraordinary ability to transform ordinary conversations into vivid dreams. A simple promise can become a detailed future. A destination mentioned casually can become a place already imagined in the mind. A wedding discussed often enough begins to feel inevitable. Maria was not dreaming of wealth or status. She was dreaming of peace. Of waking each morning without feeling the weight of public judgment. Of raising her child in greater stability. Of becoming someone's wife instead of someone's scandal. Those were profoundly human dreams. They remain profoundly human today. And perhaps that is why her story continues to resonate after so many generations. Most people recognize something familiar in Maria's hopes. The desire to be loved honestly. The desire to leave painful memories behind. The desire to believe that the next chapter will finally be kinder than the last. She could not know that the man promising to help her reach that future had already become the greatest danger she would ever face. To her, he represented escape. To history, he would become the reason her name could never escape the tragedy that followed. As spring sunlight returned to the fields surrounding Paul Stead in 1827, Maria stood on the edge of what she believed was a new beginning. She had every reason to imagine that her hardest years were finally behind her. The road ahead seemed uncertain, certainly, but uncertainty can still be filled with hope. She could not see what waited beyond that hope. Neither could her family. Neither could the village. Only one person knew that the future Maria imagined would never arrive. And he intended to make certain that no one would learn the truth for a very long time. Hope is one of the most powerful forces in human life. It encourages people to endure hardship that logic alone might find unbearable. It allows them to imagine a future that has not yet arrived, to believe that tomorrow can erase the disappointments of yesterday. For Maria Martin, hope was not an abstract idea. It was something she clung to every time she looked beyond the narrow boundaries of Paul Stead and imagined a life where she was no longer defined by whispers or remembered only for the mistakes that others refused to let her forget. By the middle of the 1820s, Maria had already experienced more loss than many people twice her age. The death of her infant son had left a wound that could never fully heal. No matter how much time passes, the loss of a child changes the way a parent sees the world. Daily routines continue because they must, but ordinary moments become quietly haunted by thoughts of what might have been. A cradle sits empty. A familiar sound never returns. The future once imagined dissolves into memories that never had the chance to become reality. There are few surviving records describing how Maria carried that grief, but grief often leaves traces that cannot be measured by official documents. It shapes decisions. It alters expectations. It deepens the longing for stability, for a place where life might finally stop demanding so much. She was still a young woman, yet she had already learned that happiness could disappear without warning. Then came another relationship. Another child. Another chapter complicated by the rigid expectations of the society around her. Maria loved her son, Thomas Henry, deeply. Whatever criticism existed within the village, Motherhood was now at the center of her life. Every decision she made affected not only herself but the future of her child. Raising a child outside marriage in early 19th century England was far more than a personal challenge. It carried practical consequences that reached into every part of daily existence. Financial security became uncertain. Social acceptance became fragile. Opportunities narrowed. For many women, marriage offered the clearest path toward protecting both themselves and their children. That reality should never be mistaken for desperation. It was practicality. It was responsibility. It was a mother trying to build a safer future. When William Corder entered that future, he did not present himself as someone offering temporary comfort. He spoke of permanence. Marriage was not described as a distant possibility but as a plan. The prospect of leaving Polstead together promised something Maria had not possessed in years, the opportunity to begin again somewhere no one knew her history. It is impossible to know the private conversations they shared. History preserves outcomes more faithfully than emotions. Yet actions often reveal what words cannot. Maria continued investing in the relationship. She trusted him enough to believe that a wedding truly lay ahead. She prepared herself emotionally for a life beyond the village. Those are not the actions of someone expecting betrayal. Those are the actions of someone choosing to believe. Trust, once given, changes the way people interpret the world around them. Small delays become understandable. Unexpected complications seem temporary. Explanations that might otherwise invite suspicion are accepted because they come from someone whose intentions are assumed to be sincere. This is not weakness. It is how healthy human relationships are supposed to function. The tragedy arises when one person honors that trust while the other quietly exploits it. William appears to have understood exactly how powerful reassurance could be. Unlike Maria, whose future depended upon honesty, he retained complete control over the information she received. He determined when plans would change, when explanations would be offered, and how uncertainty would be framed. Every promise encouraged patience. Every delay became another opportunity to maintain control. Manipulation often begins long before violence. It thrives by replacing doubt with confidence. Victims are not overwhelmed all at once. Instead, they are guided gently toward conclusions that benefit the manipulator. By the time the truth becomes visible, escape has often become far more difficult than outsiders later imagine. There is another aspect of Maria's life that deserves careful attention. She was not isolated from her family. The Martins were close enough that her disappearance would later provoke relentless questions rather than quiet acceptance. Thomas Martin worked tirelessly to support his household despite limited means. Anne Martin, though remembered primarily because of the dreams that later became famous, shared in the daily responsibilities of keeping the family together. Their home was not perfect, but it was one in which Maria remained connected to those who cared about her. Leaving Polstead would therefore mean more than changing addresses. It meant saying goodbye to familiar faces, to childhood memories, to parents who had watched her grow from infancy into adulthood. Such decisions are rarely made lightly. For Maria to embrace that possibility suggests she genuinely believed something worth sacrificing for awaited beyond the village. Perhaps she imagined returning one day with happier news. Perhaps she pictured introducing her husband to relatives no longer burdened by embarrassment or pity. Perhaps she believed the next visit home would finally silence every rumor that had followed her for so long. Dreams like these are painfully ordinary. They belong to countless people preparing for marriage, packing treasured belongings, imagining a new home, wondering what life will look like a year from now. History often remembers the dramatic ending while forgetting the simple hopes that came before it. Maria deserves to be remembered for those hopes. She laughed. She planned. She anticipated. She expected life to continue. That expectation is precisely what makes her story so heartbreaking. The final weeks before her disappearance appeared outwardly unremarkable. Spring settled comfortably over Suffolk. Farmers worked longer hours beneath improving weather. Village routines continued almost unchanged. There was no public confrontation. No dramatic warning that violence was approaching. Whatever private conversations unfolded between Maria and William remained largely invisible to everyone else. That invisibility would later become one of the investigation's greatest frustrations. Without witnesses, historians are left reconstructing events through fragments of testimony, surviving letters, and courtroom evidence. We know where the story ended, but the emotional journey that carried Maria toward that ending can only be understood through the choices she made. Those choices consistently point toward optimism rather than fear. She prepared to leave. She believed in the wedding. She trusted the man who invited her to meet him. There is no credible evidence suggesting she expected the encounter to become dangerous. Quite the opposite. Everything indicates that she believed she was walking toward the future she had spent months imagining. Meanwhile, William Corder's life reflected a very different pattern. Where Maria searched for stability, William repeatedly demonstrated an ability to move between identities and responsibilities with unsettling ease. His earlier brushes with dishonesty hinted at someone increasingly comfortable placing personal convenience above moral obligation. While outwardly maintaining the appearance of an attentive partner, he also carried the habits of a man accustomed to solving problems through deception rather than accountability. That contrast lies at the emotional heart of this case. Maria's defining quality was hope. William's defining quality was control. Hope opens itself to another person. Control seeks to dominate them. One builds trust. The other exploits it. As the days slipped quietly toward the 18th of May, 1827, neither the Martin family nor the wider village sensed that they were approaching the final ordinary moments they would ever share with Maria. She remained, in their eyes, a daughter preparing for marriage, a young mother searching for a better future, and a familiar face they fully expected to see again. No one imagined that the next time they would search for her, they would not be looking toward the road leading out of Polstead. They would be looking beneath the earth itself. Maria Martin's story has often been overshadowed by the circumstances of her death. Over the years, countless retellings have focused on the mystery of the Red Barn, the strange dreams of Anne Martin, the trial of William Corder, and the crowds who gathered to witness the final chapter of the case. But beneath all the fascination surrounding the crime lies a quieter, more important truth. Maria was a woman who wanted the same things many people still want today. A safe home. A loving relationship. A future where she could be valued rather than judged. A chance to be more than the worst moments of her past. The tragedy is that she found someone who appeared to offer those things, only to discover too late that the person she trusted most would become the person who destroyed everything she hoped for. To understand Maria fully, it is important to see the society surrounding her not only as a place of judgment, but also as a world where choices were severely limited. A young woman born into a working-class rural family did not have endless opportunities to redefine herself. Education was limited. Employment options were restricted. Social mobility was difficult. A woman's security was often closely tied to her family connections and marital status. Marriage could transform a person's position overnight. A woman who had once been the subject of gossip could suddenly be viewed differently if she became the respectable wife of a husband with a stable income. The same community that criticized her could begin treating her with greater acceptance. For Maria, marriage to William represented more than affection. It represented restoration. It represented the possibility that the village might finally stop looking backward. Perhaps that is why the promise of a wedding carried such emotional importance. It was not simply about standing beside someone she loved. It was about reclaiming control over her own story. Throughout history, many victims of crime have been reduced to the moment when their lives ended. Their final hours become the focus, while the years before them disappear. The public remembers the tragedy but forgets the person. Maria's life deserves more than that. Before she became a name in a criminal case, she had spent 25 years experiencing the ordinary joys and struggles of being human. She knew family disagreements. She knew moments of happiness. She knew disappointment. She knew the exhaustion of hardship. She knew the complicated emotions of motherhood. She knew what it meant to hope for something better. The details preserved about her life are incomplete, but even fragments reveal someone who continued moving forward despite difficulties that might have overwhelmed many others. She did not allow every setback to convince her that happiness was impossible. Instead, she kept searching for it. That persistence may have been one of her greatest strengths. It was also the quality that made her vulnerable to someone who understood how to imitate sincerity. People like William Corder rarely gain trust by appearing cruel. They gain trust by appearing exactly like the person someone has been waiting to meet. They listen. They reassure. They create a sense of safety. They become associated with relief from pain. For Maria, William arrived at a moment when the possibility of a new beginning mattered deeply. He did not simply become a romantic partner. He became connected to the idea of escape. Escape from gossip. Escape from disappointment. Escape from a past that others constantly used to define her. This is why the relationship between Maria and William remains such a significant part of the case. The crime was not committed against a stranger. It was committed against someone who had opened her life to him. The betrayal was not only physical. It was emotional. The person Maria believed would protect her became the person she needed protection from. That realization is what makes the story so painful. A stranger can harm the body. A trusted person can destroy the sense of safety that allows someone to move through the world without fear. In the weeks before her disappearance, Maria likely continued living with the ordinary concerns of daily life. There were no signs visible to the outside world that she was approaching danger. She was not preparing for a final journey. She was preparing for a transition. The clothing she planned to wear. The belongings she intended to take. The conversations she had with family members. These were not the actions of someone expecting tragedy. They were the actions of someone preparing for change. According to the accounts surrounding the case, William instructed Maria to disguise herself in men's clothing before they left together. The explanation was practical on the surface, avoiding attention during their journey. To Maria, it may have seemed like another small detail in the larger plan of beginning their married life elsewhere. But viewed through the lens of what happened next, that detail becomes deeply unsettling. A simple request. A reasonable explanation. A final step in a plan that Maria believed would lead toward freedom. The same action that may have represented excitement and anticipation for her was, in reality, part of the final deception surrounding her disappearance. This contrast defines the tragedy of Maria Martin. The distance between what she believed was happening and what was actually happening could not have been greater. She saw a road leading toward a new home. William saw a situation he needed to control. She imagined future conversations. He imagined avoiding consequences. She trusted. He deceived. The morning of May 18, 1827, arrived without any indication that it would become a date remembered for generations. The countryside looked the same. The village followed its familiar rhythm. People continued with their own concerns, unaware that one of their neighbors was about to walk into history. Maria was 25 years old. Still young enough to imagine many years ahead. Still young enough to believe that difficult chapters could be followed by happier ones. Still young enough to think that the promises made to her carried the same meaning she gave them. That final point is perhaps the most heartbreaking. Maria did not walk toward the Red Barn because she was careless. She walked there because she believed someone she loved. She walked there because she had spent years searching for acceptance and thought she had finally found it. She walked there because hope, despite everything she had endured, was still alive inside her. The world remembers the Red Barn as the place where Maria Martin's life ended. But before it became a crime scene, it was simply a location where a young woman believed she was about to begin again. That distinction matters. Because every victim has a life before the crime. Every victim has dreams before tragedy. Every victim is more than the final moment that took them away. Maria Martin was not born into history. She was placed there by violence. And before the world knew her as the woman at the center of the Red Barn murder, she was simply Maria, a daughter, a mother, and a young woman who believed that somewhere beyond the judgment of her past, a better future was waiting for her. On the morning of May 18, 1827, the countryside around Paulstead looked much like it had on countless mornings before. The fields were waking beneath the spring sky. The narrow roads that crossed the village carried the familiar signs of rural life. Farmers moved through their daily routines, animals needed tending, and households prepared for another ordinary day shaped by work and necessity. Nothing in the landscape suggested that before the day ended, a young woman from the village would disappear forever and that the name of a quiet farming community would become known throughout Britain. For Maria Martin, however, this day did not begin as an ending. It began as a promise. She believed she was stepping toward the future she had spent months imagining. A marriage. A new home. A life away from the judgment that had followed her for years. That belief is what makes the events of that day so devastating. Maria was not walking into the unknown. She was walking toward someone she trusted. The man waiting for her was William Corder. To understand the horror of what happened at the Red Barn, it is important to remember the emotional reality of that final meeting. This was not a confrontation between strangers. This was not a random encounter in which two people crossed paths by chance. It was a meeting between two people who shared a history, who had spoken about the future, and who had built a relationship around promises that Maria believed were genuine. She likely approached the barn carrying the same mixture of emotions that many people experience before a major life change. Excitement. Nervousness. Uncertainty. Hope. Leaving home, even under positive circumstances, is never simple. It means separating from familiar places and people. It means stepping away from the life one knows and entering a world that cannot yet be fully understood. For Maria, that uncertainty was softened by the belief that she would not be facing it alone. William would be there. That was the foundation of her confidence. The plan, as she understood it, was simple. They would leave Paulstead together, travel to Ipswich, and eventually marry. To avoid attracting attention during their departure, William suggested that Maria dress in men's clothing. Such a disguise may have seemed unusual, but within the context of the time, it could be explained as a practical measure for a couple attempting to leave quietly. For Maria, it was another detail in a larger plan. For William, history would suggest it was part of something much darker. The Red Barn stood waiting beyond the village. At that moment, it was still only what it had always been, a farm building surrounded by fields. Its wooden walls held no visible sign of the terrible event that would soon make it infamous. The building itself was silent, ordinary, almost forgettable. That is perhaps what makes the location so unsettling. The most horrifying places in history are often not frightening before tragedy occurs. They become frightening because of what happened there. A room becomes a crime scene. A road becomes a memorial. A building becomes a symbol. The Red Barn's transformation began with Maria's final journey toward it. No witness recorded her arrival. No one could later describe her expression, her final conversation, or the exact moment when her understanding of the situation changed. The absence of witnesses created a mystery that investigators would struggle with for months. What happened inside the barn? How long was Maria there? Did she recognize the danger before it was too late? Did she attempt to escape? Did she call for help? These questions have remained unanswered because the person who knew the truth chose never to reveal it. The only surviving account of that day came through the evidence collected afterward and the conflicting statements of William Corder himself. And those statements changed. Again and again. After Maria disappeared, William attempted to create a story that would explain her absence without revealing the truth. But every explanation he offered depended on one central idea, that Maria had left willingly. The problem was that the truth hidden beneath the Red Barn contradicted everything he wanted people to believe. The moment Maria entered that building, she was alone with a man who had already placed himself in control of the situation. He knew where they were. He knew what others expected to happen. He knew that if his plan succeeded, Maria's disappearance could be mistaken for a voluntary departure. That calculation is one of the most disturbing elements of the case. The crime was not followed by immediate panic. It was followed by performance. A performance designed to convince everyone that nothing terrible had occurred. After Maria vanished, William did not behave like someone desperately searching for a missing loved one. Instead, he began constructing an alternative reality. He communicated with Maria's family. He offered explanations. He created distance between himself and the consequences of his actions. Every message served the same purpose. Delay suspicion. Maintain trust. Keep the truth buried. The tragedy of Maria's disappearance was intensified by the fact that those who loved her had no immediate reason to believe she was dead. They were not searching for a murderer. They were waiting for a daughter to return. They were waiting for letters. They were waiting for news. They were waiting for reassurance that the future Maria had described was still possible. And William gave them exactly what they wanted to hear. He claimed that Maria and he had married. He suggested they were living elsewhere. When questions arose about why Maria did not write herself, he provided explanations that appeared reasonable under the circumstances. She was ill. She was unable to communicate. There were difficulties preventing contact. Each statement was another thread added to the illusion. A convincing lie is rarely built from one enormous facade. It is usually created from many smaller ones. Each individual detail seems possible. Together, they create a reality that exists only because someone has carefully maintained it. For months, that reality surrounded the Martin family. They were grieving without knowing they were grieving. They were missing someone who was already gone. They were holding on to hope because William had given them permission to do so. Meanwhile, beneath the ground of the Red Barn, Maria remained hidden. The seasons continued changing above her. Spring moved toward summer. Summer eventually gave way to autumn. Rain fell. Winds passed over the fields. Farmers continued their work. The world outside the barn continued moving forward while the truth remained trapped beneath the earth. This contrast is one of the most haunting aspects of the case. A terrible act had occurred, yet life around it continued almost normally. The villagers did not know they were walking near a grave. They did not know that a young woman whose name they recognized was lying beneath a place they had passed countless times. They did not know that the person responsible was not a distant stranger, but someone who had once walked among them. William Corder had relied on the ordinary rhythm of village life. He relied on distance. He relied on uncertainty. He relied on the possibility that Maria's disappearance would eventually be accepted as a simple departure. For a time, it appeared that his plan had worked. But secrets have a way of becoming heavier with time. And the secret buried beneath the Red Barn would eventually become impossible to carry. The days following Maria Martin's disappearance revealed the true depth of William Corder's deception. A person who had committed a crime driven by panic might have behaved unpredictably, might have fled without a plan, might have made careless mistakes under the pressure of fear. But William did something far more calculated. He built a story. He created a version of events in which Maria was not a missing woman, but a woman who had chosen to leave. That distinction mattered. Because a missing person demands questions. A woman who willingly departs does not. Every explanation William offered was designed to move those questions away from him. At first, the people around Maria had no reason to believe they were being deceived. The idea that she had left with William was not impossible. In fact, considering their relationship and their plans for marriage, it was exactly the outcome many expected. Maria had spoken about a new life. She had believed she was going somewhere better. Her family knew she wanted stability, and William had presented himself as the person who could provide it. The truth was hidden behind something painfully simple. The story sounded believable because parts of it were true. Maria really did want to leave. Maria really did intend to marry William. Maria really did hope for a different future. William did not need to invent an entirely new reality. He only needed to twist the one Maria already believed in. This is what made his deception so effective. He used Maria's own dreams as the foundation of the lie. 4 months after her disappearance, The Martin family lived in a strange space between concern and reassurance. They missed Maria, but they were repeatedly encouraged to believe that she was safe. They had no body, no witness, and no immediate evidence suggesting violence. Instead, they had letters and explanations. Letters became the substitute for Maria herself. Each message carried the appearance of connection while actually creating greater distance. The family could see words written about Maria, but they could not hear her voice. They could receive updates about her life, but they could not confirm them directly. The person who should have been communicating with them had become silent, and the person controlling the story was the very person they had the most reason to question. Yet suspicion did not come easily. That is an important part of understanding this case. From the outside, it may seem obvious that William's explanations should have raised immediate alarm. But people living through the situation did not possess the knowledge that later generations would inherit. They were not watching the events unfold with the certainty of history. They were experiencing them day by day, hoping that each new message would bring comfort rather than another reason to worry. Hope can be powerful enough to delay fear. Especially when fear means accepting a reality that feels impossible. For Maria's family, the alternative was unbearable. To believe William meant accepting that Maria's dreams had ended in violence. To believe William meant admitting that the marriage she had imagined was never going to happen. To believe William meant facing the possibility that their daughter, sister, and loved one was gone forever. The human mind often resists devastating conclusions until evidence becomes impossible to ignore. William benefited from that natural resistance. As time passed, however, his behavior revealed a growing pattern of control. He had removed Maria from the village physically, but he also attempted to control how people remembered her absence. He decided what her family heard. He decided what explanations were provided. He decided how much information was available. In doing so, he attempted to become the only connection between Maria and the outside world. But every lie carries a weakness. It requires maintenance. A truthful event needs no constant adjustment. It exists independently. A false story, however, must be repeatedly supported, because every unanswered question creates another crack. Why had Maria not returned? Why had she not written personally? Why were there always new reasons for her silence? Why did the future she had described never seem to arrive? The longer the silence continued, the more fragile William's story became. Yet while those questions slowly formed in Suffolk, William was already creating an entirely different life for himself elsewhere. He left behind the village where people knew his history and traveled to London, a city large enough to hide almost anyone. For someone seeking to escape suspicion, London offered something rural communities could not: anonymity. In Paul's stead, William was William Corder. People knew his family. They knew his reputation. They knew his connection to Maria. In London, he could become someone new. A person was no longer defined by childhood memories or village gossip. The city was filled with strangers, each person carrying their own secrets, each person too occupied with survival to investigate the past of every newcomer. It was the perfect environment for reinvention. And William embraced that opportunity. He began presenting himself not as a man connected to a missing woman, but as someone with a future ahead of him. He developed new relationships. He established a new identity. Eventually, he married another woman, creating a life built upon a foundation of deception. The contrast between Maria's fate and William's behavior is one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. Maria's life had been taken away. William was attempting to continue his. She had disappeared beneath the earth. He was moving freely through society. She was denied the future she imagined. He was attempting to construct one for himself. That imbalance is precisely why the discovery of the truth became so important. Without justice, Maria would have remained only a missing woman. Her story would have ended with uncertainty. Her family would have been left wondering. The village would have carried a question rather than an answer. But beneath the surface, something had changed. The disappearance that William hoped would fade into the background was beginning to attract attention. People began looking more closely. The explanations began to feel less convincing. The absence of Maria's own voice became increasingly difficult to ignore. And then came the moment that changed everything. A year after Maria vanished, the search moved back toward the place William had tried hardest to forget. The Red Barn. The very location he believed would keep his secret hidden became the place where that secret would finally be revealed. When Maria's remains were discovered beneath the floor, William's carefully constructed world collapsed almost instantly. The letters. The excuses. The promises. The false future. All of it became evidence of something much darker. The family that had been waiting for Maria to return was forced to confront the truth they had spent months hoping was not true. She had not left. She had not started a new life. She had not forgotten them. She had been there all along. The discovery transformed the entire case. Before that moment, William's story still existed as a possibility. After that moment, it became a deception. The question was no longer whether Maria had chosen to disappear. The question was what William had done to her. And for the first time, the man who had controlled the story was no longer able to decide how it would end. The discovery beneath the Red Barn would eventually become the moment that defined the entire case, but before that discovery came a period of silence. A silence that lasted nearly a year. A silence in which Maria Martin's family lived between hope and uncertainty, never knowing that the person they were waiting for would never walk back through their door. For William Corder, that silence was an opportunity. For Maria's loved ones, it was a slow and painful absence. Time continued moving forward, indifferent to what had happened. The fields around Paulstead changed with the seasons. The warmth of spring gave way to summer. The golden colors of harvest appeared across the countryside before disappearing beneath the colder tones of autumn and winter. Rain fell on the same roads Maria had once walked. The wind moved through the same trees. The village continued its routines. But one person was missing. And everyone who cared about her felt that absence. Missing someone is a strange form of suffering. There is no clear ending. No moment when grief can fully begin because hope remains alive. A funeral allows people to say goodbye. A disappearance leaves a person trapped between presence and absence. They are gone, but not completely. They exist in memories, in unanswered questions, in every moment when someone instinctively expects them to appear. For the Martin family, Maria's disappearance created that unbearable uncertainty. Perhaps she would return. Perhaps the next letter would explain everything. Perhaps circumstances had simply prevented her from coming home. Those possibilities were painful, but they were easier to hold onto than the alternative. William understood this. Whether through deliberate calculation or instinctive manipulation, he provided exactly enough reassurance to keep suspicion from becoming certainty. He did not need everyone to believe every detail. He only needed them to continue hoping. Hope delays investigation. Hope postpones the moment when people are forced to accept the worst. And in this case, every day that passed gave William more time to separate himself from the crime. The distance between Paulstead and London worked in his favor. The village remembered Maria. The city did not. In London, William could walk through crowded streets without every passerby knowing his connection to the missing woman from Suffolk. He could enter shops, meet new people, and create a new impression of himself. The man who had left behind suspicion became, in another environment, simply another resident trying to establish a life. That ability to reinvent himself revealed something important about William's character. He was not merely attempting to escape punishment. He was attempting to erase the version of himself connected to Maria. He wanted the world to see a different man. A respectable man. A man with a future. A man whose past remained hidden. But the past has a way of following people, especially when it involves another human life. While William was building his new identity, the memory of Maria remained alive among those who knew her. Her family continued carrying questions that had no answers. Her absence became increasingly difficult to explain. The longer she remained away, the more unusual the situation became. A woman preparing for marriage would normally leave behind some trace. A message. A personal letter. A visit. Some indication that she was safe. But Maria had disappeared completely. The only information about her came from William. And eventually, that became the very thing that made people question him. Trust depends on consistency. When explanations constantly require adjustment, even the most patient people begin noticing the pattern. The story William created could survive for a while because it was built around what people wanted to believe. But reality does not disappear simply because people are not ready to face it. It waits. And in this case, reality was waiting beneath the floor of an ordinary barn. The red barn itself had continued standing quietly through all those months. The building that had once represented nothing more than farm work had become the silent keeper of a terrible secret. Every person who passed nearby unknowingly moved close to the evidence that would eventually expose the truth. This is one of the most haunting elements of the case. The murder was not hidden in some distant wilderness. It was hidden in a familiar place. A place people knew. A place they could see. The ordinary appearance of the location became part of the deception. People expect terrible things to happen in terrible places. But history repeatedly shows that violence can occur in the most ordinary surroundings. A quiet village. A familiar road. A building used for everyday work. The horror lies not in the location itself, but in the fact that life continued around it without knowing what had happened. By early 1828, nearly a year had passed since Maria vanished. The uncertainty that once protected William was beginning to weaken. The questions had not disappeared. They had only been waiting. And then came the event that transformed suspicion into undeniable reality. And Martin began speaking about the dreams. The details of those dreams would become one of the most famous aspects of the entire case. According to accounts later repeated in newspapers and books, and repeatedly dreamed that Maria had been murdered and buried beneath the red barn. To modern observers, the story invites immediate fascination. Some see it as something mysterious. Some see it as coincidence. Some believe and subconscious may have connected details she had already noticed but could not consciously explain. Perhaps she had sensed inconsistencies in William's story. Perhaps she had noticed changes in behavior that others ignored. Perhaps grief and fear shaped her dreams into a vivid warning. The truth cannot be proven. But what can be proven is what happened next. Anne's conviction became strong enough that the family returned their attention to the place William most wanted forgotten. The Red Barn. On April 19, 1828, Thomas Martin searched the area. He did not know exactly what he would find. He may have hoped to discover nothing. Sometimes people search for answers while secretly praying that those answers will prove them wrong. But beneath the ground was a truth that could no longer be hidden. Maria was found. The young woman who had been described in letters as alive and living elsewhere was discovered exactly where Anne had believed she was. The moment must have been devastating beyond words. For nearly a year, Maria's family had been trapped between fear and hope. Now hope was gone. The uncertainty was gone. In its place was grief. The realization that every letter had been part of a lie. Every reassurance had delayed the truth. Every promise of a happy future had been meaningless. The discovery did more than reveal Maria's fate. It exposed William's entire deception. The story he had built collapsed under the weight of physical evidence. A missing woman had become a murder victim. A lover had become the primary suspect. A promise of marriage had been revealed as a path leading toward betrayal. And the village that had once whispered about Maria's reputation now faced a far more shocking question. How could someone they knew have committed such a crime? The search for Maria was over. But the search for justice had only begun. William Corder had spent nearly a year controlling the story. Now the story belonged to Maria. And the truth buried beneath the Red Barn was about to bring the entire country's attention down upon him. The discovery of Maria Martin's remains beneath the floor of the Red Barn transformed a village mystery into a national obsession. Until that moment, the people of Paulstead had been living with uncertainty. They had questions, suspicions, and uneasy feelings, but they lacked the one thing that could turn doubt into certainty. Evidence. When the earth gave up what had been hidden beneath it for nearly a year, the case changed forever. The Red Barn was no longer simply a location connected to a missing woman. It had become a crime scene. And within that crime scene were the final pieces of Maria's story. The discovery itself was shocking not only because of what was found, but because of where it was found. 4 months, the building had remained part of the ordinary landscape. People had walked near it. Farmers had continued their work. The seasons had passed above the ground without revealing what lay beneath. The barn had been hiding a secret in plain sight. That was what disturbed many people most. The idea that something so terrible could happen in such an ordinary place challenged the comforting belief that danger always announces itself. The Red Barn did not look threatening. It did not stand in a remote wilderness or an abandoned area where people expected darkness. It was familiar. And familiarity made the discovery even more frightening. As news spread through Paulstead, people began gathering near the location. Curiosity mixed with disbelief. Neighbors who had known Maria or William personally now stood face to face with a reality they had never imagined. The same community that once discussed marriages, harvests, and village gossip was suddenly discussing murder. The questions came quickly. How long had Maria been beneath the floor? Who had placed her there? How had no one discovered the truth sooner? And perhaps the most painful question of all. Why? Why would someone she trusted do this to her? The examination of Maria's remains presented investigators with both answers and uncertainties. Nearly 12 months had passed since her disappearance, and the condition of the body reflected the passage of time. Decomposition had taken away much of the physical evidence that might have provided a simple explanation. In modern investigations, forensic science often allows experts to reconstruct events with extraordinary detail. In 1828, investigators had far fewer tools available. They had observation. They had testimony. They had physical objects. And they had the difficult task of interpreting evidence without the technology that exists today. The remains showed signs consistent with violence. There were indications of injury. There were wounds that suggested Maria had not died naturally. But determining the exact cause of death proved challenging. Different possibilities emerged. Some evidence suggested she may have been shot. Other injuries suggested the use of a knife or another sharp instrument. There were also indications that strangulation might have played a role, with investigators focusing on the possibility that a scarf or cloth belonging to William had been used. The uncertainty did not weaken the case against William. If anything, it revealed the brutality of what had happened. Maria had not simply vanished. She had not accidentally died during a journey. Someone had caused her death and then attempted to erase her existence. The discovery also provided a powerful contradiction to the story William had carefully maintained. For months, he had encouraged people to believe that Maria was alive. That she had left willingly. That she was somewhere beyond Suffolk building a new life. But the ground beneath the Red Barn told a completely different story. Every physical detail became a silent challenge to his version of events. The clothing. The location. The condition of the remains. The circumstances of burial. Each piece suggested preparation rather than accident. The discovery of the body also changed the emotional landscape of the investigation. Before that day, Maria's family had been searching for a missing daughter. After that day, they were seeking justice for a murdered one. The difference between those two realities is enormous. When someone is missing, families imagine reunions. They picture doors opening. They imagine hearing a familiar voice again. When murder is confirmed, those possibilities disappear forever. The grieving process changes instantly because hope is replaced by finality. For Thomas and Anne Martin, the discovery must have been devastating in a way that words struggle to capture. The same place that had existed in their minds as a possible answer became the place where their worst fears were confirmed. The barn had become a grave. And the man who had promised to protect Maria had become the person accused of putting her there. As investigators began examining the scene, attention naturally turned toward William Corder. There were now no reasonable explanations left that could place him outside the center of suspicion. He had been the last person known to have been with Maria. He had provided the stories explaining her absence. He had benefited from her disappearance. And now the evidence showed that his account could not be true. A murder investigation requires more than suspicion, however. It requires connecting the person accused with the crime itself. That connection would come through a combination of circumstances, testimony, and the mistakes William had made while attempting to maintain his deception. Because while he had successfully convinced people for months that Maria was alive, he had also left behind a trail of choices that could be examined. The letters. The false explanations. The sudden movement away from Suffolk. The attempt to create a new life. The careful avoidance of returning to the place where Maria was found. All of these details now appeared different. Before the discovery, they could be interpreted as ordinary circumstances surrounding a woman who had left. After the discovery, they became signs of a deliberate attempt to hide the truth. This is one of the most important moments in any criminal investigation. Evidence does not exist in isolation. The meaning of evidence changes depending on what is already known. A letter claiming someone is alive may appear comforting when there is no reason to doubt it. The same letter becomes something entirely different when that person is found dead. A journey away from home may appear ordinary. The same journey becomes suspicious when it follows a murder. A delayed response may seem harmless. The same delay becomes significant when it prevents the discovery of the truth. The Red Barn investigation was built upon this transformation. Ordinary details became extraordinary. Small inconsistencies became major clues. The story William had created began collapsing piece by piece. Yet one question remained. Where was William Corder? The discovery of Maria's remains meant justice required finding the man who had buried her. But William was no longer in Suffolk. He had already moved on, believing distance could protect him. He had escaped the village where everyone knew his name. He had built a new existence among strangers. He may have believed the past was finally behind him. He was wrong. Because the discovery beneath the Red Barn had accomplished something William had spent months trying to prevent. It had given Maria a voice. She could no longer speak for herself. But the evidence left behind would speak on her behalf. And soon, the entire country would be listening. The investigation into Maria Martin's death began with a scene that offered both answers and uncertainty. In many ways, the Red Barn provided investigators with exactly what they needed, proof that a crime had occurred. But it also presented them with the difficulties that defined criminal investigations in the early 19th century. There was no modern forensic science to guide them. No laboratory analysis. No DNA evidence. No digital trail. No cameras capturing a final moment. Instead, investigators had to rely on the physical evidence left behind, the memories of those who knew Maria and William, and the careful examination of every inconsistency in the story that had been told. The ground beneath the Red Barn had revealed the truth, but it did not reveal every detail. The exact sequence of events remained hidden. That uncertainty became one of the most discussed aspects of the case. How did Maria die? What happened in those final moments? What was William's state of mind? The investigation could answer some questions. Others would remain unanswered forever. The condition of Maria's remains made the work especially difficult. Nearly a year had passed since she disappeared. Time had changed the evidence. The body could no longer provide the clear answers that investigators might have hoped for. The passage of months had erased details, leaving only fragments of what had occurred. Yet even those fragments were enough to establish one devastating fact. Maria had suffered a violent death. The injuries discovered on her remains suggested that she had not died from illness, accident, or natural causes. The possibility of murder was no longer speculation. It was reality. For investigators, the next challenge was connecting that reality to William Corder. Suspicion naturally focused on him. The circumstances surrounding Maria's disappearance placed him at the center of the investigation. He had been the person who arranged the meeting at the Red Barn. He had been the person closest to Maria before she vanished. He had been the person who provided the explanations that kept her family from immediately searching for answers. But suspicion alone was not enough. A person could appear suspicious without being guilty. Investigators needed a chain of evidence strong enough to withstand examination. And William, through his own actions, had unknowingly created many of the links that would eventually lead back to him. One of the most significant elements was the story he had constructed after Maria disappeared. At first, the explanation seemed possible. A young couple planning to marry had left together. A woman seeking a new life had gone somewhere else. A family waiting for news had no immediate reason to assume violence. But as investigators examined the situation more closely, the story began showing weaknesses. Maria had not simply vanished from a distant place. She had disappeared immediately after meeting William. The man who claimed to know where she was could not produce her. The letters that supposedly came from her were not written by her. The future William described never appeared. Every answer created another question. The investigation began to shift from searching for Maria to examining William's behavior. His actions after the disappearance became increasingly important. Instead of remaining in the community where Maria's family and investigators could question him, William had moved away. He had established himself elsewhere, far from the village where his connection to Maria was known. To investigators, distance became significant. Leaving after someone disappears does not automatically prove guilt. People leave communities for many reasons. But combined with other circumstances, it becomes another piece of a larger picture. And the picture forming around William was becoming darker. His attempt to create a new life in London attracted particular attention. London offered anonymity, but it also created a new problem. A person trying to escape one identity often has to build another. William could not simply disappear. He needed to exist. He needed employment. He needed relationships. He needed people to believe the person he presented himself as. That meant creating new connections while leaving behind the old ones. Ironically, the same confidence that allowed him to reinvent himself also helped investigators understand his character. He was not behaving like someone overwhelmed by grief. He was behaving like someone determined to continue. While Maria's family was facing the reality of her death, William was attempting to construct a future. That contrast would become one of the most powerful elements presented against him. The investigation also examined the physical evidence connected to the Red Barn. Items associated with the crime became important because they linked the location, the victim, and the suspect. Personal belongings, clothing, and other details helped investigators reconstruct the circumstances surrounding Maria's disappearance. Even without modern technology, physical objects carried enormous weight. A single item could contradict an entire story. A small inconsistency could expose a larger deception. In a case built largely on competing narratives, objects became silent witnesses. They could not be persuaded. They could not change their accounts. They simply existed. And their existence challenged William's version of events. The discovery of Maria's body also transformed public opinion. Before the remains were found, many people likely viewed the situation as a private family matter. A woman had left with a man she intended to marry. There was concern, but there was still uncertainty. After the discovery, the nature of the case changed completely. The public no longer wondered where Maria had gone. They wanted to know what William had done. The village that once discussed Maria's personal life now discussed murder. The same social environment that had once judged her choices now focused on the person who had taken her life. This shift is significant because it changed Maria's place in public memory. During her lifetime, she had often been viewed through the lens of reputation. After her death, the circumstances forced people to see her differently. She was no longer simply the subject of village gossip. She was a victim. The investigation continued moving toward one central goal, locating William Corder. But finding him would not be simple. He had a significant advantage. He was far away. He had time. He had already begun creating a different identity. And perhaps most importantly, he believed the secret beneath the red barn had remained hidden long enough that he was safe. That belief would prove to be his greatest mistake. Because while William was attempting to build a new existence, the investigation was moving closer. The truth had survived beneath the earth. Now it was following him above it. The red barn had revealed what he had tried to bury. The next step was making sure he could no longer run from it.